Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Scott. I am a senior software engineer for TB Consulting, and this is Making the Most of the Mid-Server Redux. We will be going over my Knowledge 19 presentation that I gave on utilizing the mid-server to do your bidding. So, without further ado, this is Making the Most of the Mid-Server. Okay, like I said, my name is Mark Scott. I am a ServiceNow software engineer for TB Consulting. I have 7 years software development experience in C#, MVC, Web API. I was building enterprise applications for our clients at TB Consulting. We decided to switch it up and start a ServiceNow practice, and I have been on ever since. I was also a Knowledge 17 speaker on source control and implementing that inside the ServiceNow platform. Currently, I am delivering some client implementations. We're an implementer. TB Consulting is an MSP, so we go out and do implementations for our clients and help them get the most out of their ServiceNow implementations. I'm also tasked with marrying ServiceNow and a hyper-converged infrastructure called Nutanix. Nutanix is an all-in-one box that allows you to virtualize anything within your infrastructure. And what we've built is a integration into Nutanix to pull that information into your asset CMDB and be able to look at your Nutanix infrastructure from the ServiceNow side of things. If you're interested in that, please let me know. We can get you some more information. Okay, so a little housekeeping here. So let's start with our agenda. The first thing that we're going to go through is all about mid-servers. So what are they, how do they work, and why do we use them? We're going to do some demos. I've got 2 demos for you today. And then we're going to go over the art of the possible. So why is this important and why are we doing this? So our first objective, let's learn why mid-servers are really awesome. I think mid-servers are awesome, and I think by the end of this presentation, you'll also think that mid-servers are awesome. And let's learn a little bit more about what we can do to make them work inside of our organizations. We'll also learn what makes a mid-server, why we use a mid-server. We'll define and understand the ECC queue, and augmenting the mid-server with Java. We'll also understand how to communicate to and from the mid-server using that ECC queue. So this is a really busy slide. This is mid-server 101. So where does the actual mid-server sit and how does it work inside of your firewall? So as we can see from this slide, your mid-server can connect to Linux infrastructure, desktop infrastructure, routers, Windows servers. You can even put mid-servers up into the cloud and allow it to find AWS infrastructure, Azure infrastructure. One of the cool things about the mid-server, though, is that it allows you to take on workloads. So, for example, discovery actually happens through your mid-server. You place that mid-server behind your firewall, you tell discovery what IP ranges you want to scan, and that allows you to pull in all the asset and information about your infrastructure into your ServiceNow instance. So, some of the good things that a mid-server can be used for. Anything with a long running transaction. So if I've got a long database query, if I've got to go download a file off the internet, if I've got to go make an API call, these are excellent uses for the mid-server because it just sits behind our firewall and it can do that work without us tying up our ServiceNow instance. That's really key. Our ServiceNow instance is doing good things for us. It's taking in our tickets, it's hosting our service portal, it's allowing workflows to happen without interruption. We don't really want to push workloads into ServiceNow so that it doesn't function properly. It's not, it needs to be able to do the work that it's good at doing, which is taking all that information and aggregating into one place. We don't want to put too much workload on our ServiceNow instances. Complex functions. So let's say that we have a library or a package that runs without maybe a JavaScript implementation, or there's just no way to call it from within the platform. Well, we can load that into the mid-server and execute that code remotely, and we'll see a couple of examples of that in a few minutes here. Anything that the ServiceNow platform cannot do. So if there's functionality that you're just lacking in the ServiceNow platform, you can make up for that with the mid-server. You can write your own custom code, run that on the mid-server, and have that initiated. And then lastly, we could do some image or video processing. Anything that, again, takes a while and needs to come back, we can offload that to the mid-server and allow the mid-server to do that function for us. So let's talk about some not great use cases. anything the user is waiting on. So what we don't want to do is lock up the UI so that users are waiting for our response to come back. If we've got a long-running process that runs on the mid server, the last thing we want to do is users sitting there waiting. We've got that spinning icon of death. Also, anything that needs eyeballs, since the mid server is headless, it's run as a Java package that sits on top of a server and doesn't really have any user interaction. We can't have anything, so anything that needs a button pushed or an approval process, anything like that, doesn't work if we're going to push that payload to the mid server. Okay, this is a very busy slide, but let's not get too bogged down into it. The main purpose of this slide is to show that the ECC queue and the mid server communicate in a very cyclical fashion. So what ends up happening is a record is inserted into the ECC queue table. It has a database listener. We can see that about midway through our slide here. That is pushed into the A and B channel. Now the mid server is always listening to that A and B channel through the mid server A and B client. That A and B client reads that work in, comes down, the mid server processes that, it does whatever it's told to do, and then at the end of that, it pushes it back into the ECC queue monitor, which is here. The ECC queue monitor pushes it back into the ECC queue, and then there's another insert into the ECC queue with the database listener. Really, all this is just a big fancy word for I will insert records into a table that the mid server will then do work on. The mid server will do the work, and the result of that work will then be pushed back into the ECC queue table. Okay, that's great, but how do we actually call the code from the mid server? Well, it's actually fairly easy. So once we've loaded the jar file into the mid server, now a jar file is it's Java code that has been packaged up into a single executable file and pushed down. What's nice is that the ServiceNow instance, ServiceNow itself, doesn't require you to maintain or edit that. Keep that code up to date in a specific way. So what you can do is actually push that jar file down and it will push to all your mid servers individually. You don't have to update each one. You can use the platform to monitor and manage which code package is being pushed down to the mid servers. So once it's been pushed, what we can do is inside of our JavaScript, which is very similar to a mid-server script include, they're actually called mid-server script includes, we can call this packages dot. It's a very special naming convention, and basically what happens when I say packages dot something is that hey, I'm going to call out to some extra code that's living on the mid server, and I'm going to call a function inside of a class. Now, for example, this is for a classification for an image, and you can see that the package is called com.tbconsulting. Well, I start that off again on this side with the mid server script include down at the bottom, packages.com.tbconsulting, and continue on. From there, you can see that I call this classifier class here. That classifier class corresponds to some code that I have here, and then I call this classifier.classify. I actually have a classify method inside of this code that it's then being called out to. So you can see very quickly how writing a little bit of Java code and then inserting it into our JavaScript and calling it from our JavaScript, we can actually call out to that code very simply, and it makes our jobs a lot easier. So a couple of best practices for doing this. I always like to call the Java packages from mid-server script includes. In fact, it's not just about calling it from a mid-server script include, but then anything that I'm calling from that mid-server script include, I wrap into another script include, and that just makes my code so much more maintainable. And one single point of failure, one single point of anything that I need to go and change, I can go and change that. I don't have to worry about making too many edits to something. I can reuse that mid-server script include or that script include wherever I need it to go. It travels with me. I also have found this the hard way, but since the mid server doesn't run a headed version, which means that I don't see anything, nothing happens when I execute code, it just happens in the background. What ends up happening is any error messages, any informational messages or debugging messages that I would normally get actually get pushed out to nowhere. I don't have any way of reading that. So what I like to do is I like to log all my console messages to a log file. That way, when something goes wrong or if I need to debug something, what I can do is I can open up that log file later, read through all my messages, and I can know right about where my code either crashed or if something happened unexpectedly or if everything worked just fine. Long-running processes need to run async in the background. So this is less mid-server specific and more just ServiceNow specific, right? It's always good practice to make sure that your users aren't waiting on the UI. So the last thing I want to do is click a button and then just watch my mouse wheel spin there in a circle. So what we tend to do at TB Consulting is we push all of that logic into an async business rule or an async task or an async workflow. That allows all those long-running processes to happen, and then when they're done, I can update any records that I was editing or manipulating on the fly. Deploy a dev or a test mid-server. Now this sounds pretty obvious, but I've talked to a lot of people that just don't do this religiously. What I say is, look, dev and test are made to be broken. So I can come through, I can make code, I can crash code, I can do bad things, my mid-server can go up or down without impacting production. That's an obvious thing. The other thing is we have a lot of alerts and monitoring. Well, the last thing I need to do in the middle of the day is take a production outage or trigger an alert that my infrastructure team then needs to go and debug, not knowing that maybe I caused it. So always try to deploy at least a dev server, if not a dev and a test mid server, so that you can package your code up, send it down, and allow everyone to use that server without causing issues. Okay, so now we get to the fun part. This I have as a demo of my streaming socket server. Before we can jump into that, though, I want to give everyone just a little tiny bit of perspective. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a streaming socket server on our mid server. This is a little different than the way a mid server would normally work. What happens is a request comes into our ECC queue. The ECC queue then relays that request to the mid server. The mid server then calls into my custom jar package, and my custom jar package creates a thread. Now, the thread opens the Twitter streaming API, which allows me to then take my request and return it back to the ECC queue as completed. The request comes back down to ServiceNow. ServiceNow says, hey, my request is done, and this portion disconnects completely. But you'll notice that the thread still is running on our mid server. All right, so now a tweet's going to come in. It's in a JSON format, and we can read all of the data from the tweet in a JSON. It's going to be pushed down the Twitter streaming API. The Twitter streaming API is going to alert the thread that's running in my custom jar package on the mid server. That tweet is then going to be emitted back out of the jar file into a custom API that I've developed in the ServiceNow mid server, or I'm sorry, in the ServiceNow platform. That tweet will then be ingested and stored in the ServiceNow database. It's pretty simple once you actually start to think about it, but the main problem here is that that thread is always running. So once the mid server disconnects, that thread stays alive and can still process all the information that's coming in from the Twitter streaming API. So enough talk, let's see it in action. Let's switch over to my instance here. So I have Twitter up and running. A little premature. Before we do that, so let's go and start our tweet service here. All right, so I have a service management interface here. It is incredibly simple to use this. It literally has one button, Start Server. So I'm going to push this button, and that's what's going to start our request to go out, and the mid server will start up its thread. So we can see the Twitter streaming server has started. We're going to hit OK. OK, so now let's switch to Twitter. I'm going to compose a new tweet, and what I'm going to use is the hashtag from my session from Knowledge 19. Because that's the special session, or that's the special hashtag that my thread is looking for. This is really cool. Give myself a little pat on the back here, hit tweet. Okay, so it sent the tweet. And anybody that's watching this online right now can actually go and hit hashtag CCB10089, and your tweets will actually end up in my ServiceNow instance itself as well. All right, let's switch back to ServiceNow. So let's look at our tweets here. Now, I've got a lot of tweets that have come in the last month or so. A lot of these I've saved because I'm nostalgic from Knowledge 19. And you can see this is my tweet that I just sent. So CCB 1089, this is really cool. You can see it came from me. And I have this interesting column here, time difference sec. What this actually means is this calculates the time that it was stored in the Twitter database, then emitted from the Twitter API, streaming API into my mid server, and my mid server down into my ServiceNow instance. You can see that it's 6.45 seconds. My average time for getting a tweet from Twitter's database into my database is 5.74 seconds. The thing to note here is that this isn't using a polling engine. We're not going and asking Twitter for, give me more tweets that have this hashtag in it. I'm not running on a scheduled job. These are coming in near real time, almost as live as I possibly can, so that I can process this much faster. If you want to jump into it, let's take a look at the tweet real fast. So this is really all that I have. I have the entire JSON payload of that tweet, which has all of the information about my user, about the tweet, everything. And I parse a couple of that out. So I pull the content out, I pull the username out. This tweet is an auto-generated number that I have from the ServiceNow instance, and I'm calculating the time in seconds here. And that's about it. So that's getting Twitter into the ServiceNow interface very quickly, very fast, and utilizing the mid server and not the platform. All right. Okay, so the next little demo that I have for you is actually modeled off of a TV show. So one of my favorite shows is called Silicon Valley. It's from HBO. And one of the things that they do on that show, which is really, really cool in my opinion, is they actually build an app that can categorize whether or not an image taken on a cell phone is a hot dog or not a hot dog. They call it, oddly enough, not hot dog. So when looking for this presentation, I tried to figure out, well, I'm not a data scientist. How can I build a machine learning algorithm into the ServiceNow platform without too much hassle? Well, what I decided to build was a not hot dog classifier. All right, so let's take a look at it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our incident table here. And I'm going to look for open incidents. I'll scroll through a couple here. Let's see. Okay, so let's open this incident. Incident number 2. Okay, so on my desktop, what I have is probably the most interesting subfolder in the world. It is literally just called hot dogs. And what we're going to do is we're going to take one of these hot dog images. We'll take this one right here. And we're going to pull that over and we're going to upload it into my incident. And what this is going to do is this is going to take all the bytes from that image. It's going to push them over to the mid server that I have running. The mid server is going to run a machine learning algorithm to see is this a hot dog or not. And it's going to return those results to my ticket here. And as we can see, I actually have the most interesting ITSM system in the world. I have a subsection here called hot dog. I can click on this subsection here, and I have two little variables here. My first one is my favorite variable that I've ever created. It's called hot dog confidence. And what this does is this takes that value that was returned back from the mid server, and it is 100% right now. So I am 100% a hot dog. It knows exactly what this is. And in case it wasn't super obvious to you, I have this is hot dog checkbox here. So if my hot dog confidence is over a certain level, I have a checkbox that gets checked is hot dog, and that has been checked as we uploaded this photo. All right, let's try it again. Let's see if we can find a different one. So I've got, let's see, here's a hot dog with some toppings here. So let's pull this over and we'll upload this. We'll give it a second to upload, and again, it's going out to the mid server. The mid server is doing its classification, it's coming back, and that hot dog confidence is 98.88, so it is still a hot dog. Well, that's great. How do we know that I didn't just train these for hot dogs and I keep uploading hot dogs? Well, I have the second most interesting subfolder in the world, not hot dogs. All right, so we've got a couple of food items to pick from here. So I'm gonna pick this hamburger here. This hamburger looks good. I'm gonna pull that over. I'm gonna upload that into my ticket as an attachment. We're gonna watch as it uploads and classifies and comes back. So we can see here very quickly, the hot dog confidence on that hamburger was actually less than 1%. So we've unchecked our box here. All right, Mark, that's cool, but how do I know that you didn't just machine learning algorithm food? All right. So this is me. This is my Mr. Peanut picture. I have a great story about being explicit versus implicit that leads into this picture. I welcome anyone to ask me that. I can tell that story later. So let's see if I'm a hot dog. So let's pull this down. We're going to upload this one more time here. And we're going to say that I am 1.08% hot dog, which is probably more than I would like to be. I would ideally like to be 0%, but this does pretty good as well. So you can see it's unchecked our hot dog box and kept that unchecked as well. All right. Let's see. Let's try to trick it, okay? So this is a Falcon Heavy rocket, and I guess it's kind of in the shape of a hot dog, right? It's long and cylindrical, so let's pull that over and see if that gives us any different results. All right, so a Falcon Heavy rocket is actually less of a hot dog than I am. Who knew? Okay, so we've proved our point. Let's go back. So the art of the possible here. So that's great. We've built this super fast Twitter integration into ServiceNow. But why would that matter to me? Well, one of the big trends right now is getting help online. So how do you get help online? A lot of times there's a phone number, sometimes a form to fill out, but I've actually run into a few companies now where I have to actually message them on either Facebook or Twitter or some sort of social network. Well, if you're a company that is pushing your customer service representatives that way, maybe you want to know exactly what kind of tickets are coming in. Maybe you want to upload a ticket and allow that ticket to open tickets from Twitter or Facebook. You can do that very quickly, which allows that CSR to get on that problem faster. So if you have a problem with a service, you have an outage, potentially you can be the first to know about that from Twitter, Facebook, social messaging. All right, so let's keep going. So what about the hot dog thing? What a great, funny demo, but who cares? Well, one of the big problems right now that we're seeing in Europe especially has just passed Article 13, which says that you will not be hosting any copyrighted images on any internet-connected platform. That would include ServiceNow. So how do we know that we aren't uploading copyrighted material into our ServiceNow instances? Aside from that, how do we know that potentially the attachments that people are uploading may not be work appropriate? We may actually have explicit content being uploaded into our ServiceNow instances and not know about it, which would be unfortunate. So we can actually build these machine learning algorithms and these image processing capabilities and push them down into our mid servers and allow them to classify those images and determine if they are explicit or not. And finally, putting all of this together, potentially what we could do is we could pull these tweets in from Twitter or pull in direct messages, anything from any social media platform. We can then take that and run machine learning algorithms and do sentiment analysis. Hey, are people generally happy with our product? Are people mad? Is there an outage? Do we have something going on? And we can bubble those up to the top as more important tickets that need to be addressed than the, hey, I really love your product. Okay, so that's it. That's all I have for you guys today. I'd like to thank you for joining. With that, I am going to end the stream, and I thank you guys for attending. If you have more questions, please reach out. My social media information is at the end of this deck on top of my email address. So if you have questions, please let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much.